If I can just ask everyone to take a seat, please. Please. You can carry on with your lunch and your eats. We just want to say a few words before we cross over to the US. And those who are outside can also join us inside as soon as you're able to. Okay. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vuyo Lutseke, and I'm a proud member of the Shared Value Africa Initiative and Shift Impact team. Just to really say a few words before we get going for this evening's program, that a major highlight for us and why we wanted to host the Africa Shared Value Leadership Summit in this format and at this time of the day was specifically because we wanted to be able to align our summit here in Africa with the Global Shared Value Leadership Summit that is about to start any minute now in the US. Because this is part of the global celebrations marking 10 years since the shared value business management concept was developed at Harvard Business School by Professors Michael Porter and Mark Kramer in 2011. So, and what better way to do this for us than to bring up not only one of our members here in Africa, but an organization that is also part of our global shared value network and one of our sponsors. So I'm here just now to introduce to you Lizeka Dlepu, who is the Southern Africa Head of Community Relations and Sustainability at Enel Green Power. Lizeka wears many hats and sits on various boards. Just looking at our website and her profile will give you a sense of what that is. But really, she has been with Enel Green Power since 2015 in this role particularly. She's also part of the SVI's own regional steering committee, where she represents Enel as one of our founding members. We are honored to have Sis Lizeka here with us to say a few words, really to get us started as we prepare to connect to the Global Summit and really celebrate with the rest of the world the 10 years of creating shared value. Sis Lizeka.
Thank you, Vuyo. I would like to say good afternoon to everybody here, ladies and gentlemen, and also good morning to those that are still waking up somewhere in the world. I just have to say that it is so good to be here. It's been a while since we have managed to meet physically, and it's quite exciting to be here. I am really proud to be here representing my company, our organization, Enel Green Power. For the past 3 years, Enel Green Power has been a founding member of the Shared Value Africa Initiative, demonstrating our commitment to creating shared value on the continent and helping grow the shared value business network across the continent. We are proud to be amongst the sponsors. We are proud to be among the sponsors of this 5th installment of the Africa Shared Value Leadership Summit. What an awesome journey this has been. From the time we met Tiki in 2016, it's really been an enriching experience to be part of this. As Enel Green Power, we are celebrated globally as a shared value organization. In fact, we are also a proud member of the Global Summit. And, we have demonstrated through our work that profit with purpose is one of the most powerful ways to effect change globally. Now, let me just tell you something that, share with you something that we have done in terms of measuring the change globally. So what then we did to demonstrate this change and demonstrate the link between social, environmental, and financial performance, Enel Foundation, in collaboration with Professor Mark Kramer, the FSG, Harvard Business School, members of the Shared Value Initiative, and just the NL Group, we carried out a research which was published, and it's called Hybrid Metrics, Connecting Shared Value to Shareholder Value. So that is very important. So if you do find time, please visit our NL Foundation website and download this report, because whatever efforts you are making towards creating shared value, you will find ways to measure your financial performance and link it to your social and environmental performance. So we have also seen in the last 2 years that business cannot thrive if society in which it operates is failing. And I think all of us are saying the same thing. We are repeating the same thing. That's how strongly we feel about this creating shared value. So what we then need to do, we just need all of us to come together across sectors, across borders, just to look at how we can profitably address issues that affect our societies and also our host environments. This year, the Shared Value Network across the world celebrates 10 years since this framework was developed by Professors Mark Kramer and Michael Porter. And in further entrenching that connection, the link between the African Summit and the Global Summit has been created. Now, as NL, our participation in both the platforms helps to highlight the importance of shared value across borders. We are proud of being part of this global footprint and movement. In fact, while we have had Maria Cristina Papetti, who's from NL, giving a keynote address for the Africa Summit, we've also had our group CEO, Francesco Starace, participating at a global summit in New York 2017. This is a reflection of how NL Group is committed to creating shared value. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is with pleasure that I now announce the crossover to the Global Summit for more enriching discourse for our business community. So please enjoy. On my side, bye-bye.
For making this event possible and open to the public. Through the generous support of Merck, 3M, Abbott, HCA Healthcare, Procter & Gamble, and Sanofi, we're able to provide the public free access to an amazing roster of speakers and their ideas for change and equity. Now, I know we've been on Zoom for about 19 months now, but a few housekeeping issues. The session is being recorded, and for sessions with audience Q&A, use the Q&A function. And finally, if you're on social media, please use the hashtag and handle noted on the slide. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Bobby Silton, Managing Director of the Shared Value Initiative. Bobby, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kim. It's great to have you here. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I want to send a very special appreciation to the Shared Value Initiative partners who support our efforts throughout the year, as well as the summit sponsors whose generous gifts make this year's event open and free. We really appreciate your belief in the work that we do every day. This year is the 10th anniversary of the idea of shared value, and I can remember the energy and excitement that we all felt when the article, Creating Shared Value, was published in the Harvard Business Review. We're going to hear more from Mark Kramer later this morning about the 10 years since the publication of the article, the good news and the bad. But we all recognize that despite the contributions of shared value, the world has never been more unequal, and we need to redouble our efforts to drive toward the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. We are at a pivotal moment. We can choose to move forward in a way that continues to create an even greater divide, or we can choose to imagine and design a more inclusive system that delivers equitable access and opportunities and enables full participation by all groups, regardless of race, gender, class, caste, sexual identity, religious affiliation, physical abilities, country of origin, or geographic location. We are defining equity using the policy link definition, which states just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. This is a decisive moment. The private sector is being called upon to play a critical role. With its abundant resources, scale, and sphere of influence, the private sector can play an outsized role in delivering greater equity. Yet even as companies begin to embrace stakeholder capitalism, few companies are intentionally considering equity in their corporate purpose. And fewer still are adequately equipped to convert their intentions into meaningful action. In order to create enduring change for society, companies must first examine their broad range of practices, policies, and programs, as well as the power they deploy, to identify where their operations and activities are actively contributing to and/or upholding inequities. After this assessment, leaders must identify and implement progressive and, in some cases, corrective action that leads to more equitable outcomes. In line with this need for re-examination, FSG and the Shared Value Initiative, we've been examining our own practices as well and looking at the implementation of shared value in light of the fight for greater equity and justice around the world. We know we need to be more intentional about putting equity at the core of our own work, and we're committed to doing so. We have seen that corporate purpose and shared value are a powerful combination for driving positive, equitable change, and we're eager to expand and advance our work in this arena to create a more fair and just world. We believe that putting equity at the center of corporate purpose and shared value is fundamental to creating real change. This aspiration is ambitious and will require shifts in mindset, culture, knowledge and skill building, new strategies, and ways of operating. We want to be on that journey with companies as a strategic partner in practice, as we know this transformation will not be easy and will take time. To enable this transformation, FSG and the Shared Value Initiative have identified 3 areas of work that we will develop and deliver to help companies fulfill this vision. First, we will help companies put equity at the center of corporate purpose. This means equity should be fundamental to a company and linked to the core business with the goal of contributing to long-term mutual success of business and society through more equitable outcomes. To better understand their role in reducing disparities or increasing them, companies should examine their business operations, identify disparate impacts of current policies and practices, and seek opportunities to create greater equity. Each of these steps should elevate the ideas, experiences, and leadership of those who have been excluded or harmed by corporate practices. Historically, advancing equity has not been considered the domain of the private sector. But given the unsustainable inequities across the globe, economic, racial, gender, class, health, housing, climate impact, society needs companies to be in the business of equity. The moral imperative is clear. We believe the business imperative is too, but it needs to be developed into a concrete, convincing, and actionable case that compels the private sector to act. Making this case is our first priority. Second, we need to take the lead in evolving the practice of shared value. We continue to see shared value as an important business strategy to drive social change at scale. But we need to think about the application in a broader context in an effort to deliver more equitable societal outcomes while strengthening the company's competitive positioning and operational context. Since the shared value was conceived in 2011, its advocates have argued that shared value is the most powerful tool companies deploy to create social impact at scale. Shared value leverages the core business, which allows it to take advantage of the company's innovation pipeline and create even a greater chance of scaling because the increased social impact is actually tied to business growth. While we still believe shared value is one of the most powerful approaches companies can use to create positive impact, we recognize that shared value alone is not enough. When conceived, the concept centered on creating mutual benefit for business and society, but it did not recognize the centrality of equity across social issues and the importance of making equity a bedrock of a company's purpose. Through our work on shared value, we have observed examples of companies contributing to greater equity through their shared value efforts, while others have missed the opportunity to do so. It has become clear that equity must be a central consideration for any practice that a company leverages to address societal issues, even if there are trade-offs and added expense to do so. We continue to believe that shared value is a compelling strategy to drive competitive advantage and distinction by simultaneously addressing challenges and opportunities for business and society. But we seek to provide guidance to companies for a more holistic application of shared value that has equity at its core and recommends a portfolio of practices within a company's influence to drive for equitable outcomes. Finally, we aim to build company capacity and create a community for action to help practitioners put equity at the center of corporate purpose and evolve their shared value practices. We seek to build awareness, knowledge, skills, and a learning community that enables a deep commitment to equity and its effective activation. Without action, ideas that aspire to deliver equity will have little impact on shaping corporate efforts. For over 20 years, FSG has worked with corporate clients and partners to strengthen their positive impact on society. And since 2012, the Shared Value Initiative has contributed to this effort to take ideas from conception to action. Over the next 3 days of the Shared Value Leadership Summit, we will hear from companies and leaders who are addressing equity in arenas of economic inclusion, access to health, and climate action. We hope these conversations provide you with many inspiring ideas and specifics to help you activate change in your organization that will lead to more equitable outcomes for people and society as a whole. Thank you again for being with us, and importantly, for the work that you do every day to create a more just, equal, and sustainable world for all. Thank you so much for listening, and Kim, I'm handing it back to you.
Bobby, thank you for those framing remarks and underscoring the critical moment the private sector is confronting and the important role it needs to play in advancing more equitable outcomes for society. Now, I'd like to introduce the co-founder of FSG and the Shared Value Initiative, Mark Kramer. In addition to being a senior advisor to the SVI, Mark is a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School, where he teaches shared value to MBA students and leads the executive education course on purpose and profit. Mark, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be here today. Let me get my video right, sorry. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to have the opportunity to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of creating shared value. Actually, 10 years almost to the day since the article came out in November. And to be able to celebrate it with Bobby and Alicia and Georgina and Kim, who've been so helpful in sustaining and spreading this thinking. To be able to celebrate it with our partners in Australia and Hong Kong and Africa and India, who have helped spread this thinking around the world. And to be able to share it with all of you, I think the largest single audience we have had from around the world for any of our shared value summits over the last 10 years. So thank you for being with us. You know, I have to say these 10 years sometimes feel like they have gone by very, very quickly. And other days, they feel like it's been a very long 10 years. I have to say, I've learned a lot over the years. And for me, the journey that I've been on these 10 years has been somewhat unexpected. Because for me, the journey really started 10 years before that, when I began working with Michael Porter on strategic philanthropy and how to think about the way in which philanthropy can create greater impact by having a deeper understanding of strategy. And that's why we started FSG originally as Foundation Strategy Group, because the idea was to work with foundations to help them be more effective. But as we began to work with foundations and then later with companies, we began to see that companies have so much more impact on our world and on our lives than charities and foundations do. After all, when you think about the 100 largest economic entities in the world, more than 2/3 of them are companies rather than countries. And if we think about our daily lives, we spend more and more of our lives impacted by what is happening in our relationships with companies than by what is happening in our relationships with charities or foundations or even government. Now, that's not to say that philanthropy is unimportant or that governments are unimportant. They are both essential, and we cannot solve social problems without them. But philanthropy often works in a very fragmented way, picking out individual charities or organizations to help. And they can do a lot of good, but they can rarely solve the systemic problems that we face as a country and as a planet. And government, while it is essential to solving social problems, nonetheless is, frankly, broken, if we think about it today. In most of the world, it is not doing what is necessary to help our average citizens have good lives, to live comfortably, and to live in a world that is sustainable. So like it or not, I have come to believe that it is up to companies to have the kind of impact we need to create a fair, equitable, and sustainable world. Now, that's not easy. But I have to say, I have become quite hopeful in some ways in these last 10 years, because there is no question that the world is moving in a shared value direction. Different people and different organizations use different terms. Some might talk about inclusive capitalism, some might talk about stakeholder capitalism, others might refer to B Corps or mutual benefit or corporate purpose. But behind all of these different terms is the same idea that companies cannot separate their economic success from the well-being of their stakeholders and the society and planet on which they operate. And we have seen more and more examples of companies getting this message and embracing this idea. You know, when we wrote the article 10 years ago, Michael Porter and I said the greatest economic opportunities that we face today are solving the world's problems. Well, it's interesting, 10 years ago when that article came out, Exxon was the world's most valuable company. And Tesla was a struggling recent IPO at $17 a share. Well, today, of course, Tesla is almost 20 times more valuable than Exxon. And that prediction that seemed a bit outlandish at the time, that the way to make the most money was to help solve the world's problems, has certainly proved true for Elon Musk and for many other social entrepreneurs who have developed new countries, new enterprises that have disrupted traditional industries. And I have to say, as I look industry by industry at insurance, companies like Discovery that have found ways to become more profitable by making their customers healthier, and renewable energy, companies like Enel that are generating greater profit from renewable energy than from fossil fuels today. fintech companies that have exploded around the world, giving access to financial services and savings and loans and banking to millions of people who had no access to financial services before. Even food and beverage companies that are finding that plant-based meats and healthier foods and drinks are much more popular. And when I think about the different issues that companies touch on, it's been a real learning curve for me over these last 10 years as to how many different issues that I never would have imagined are actually shared value issues turn out to be. And one of the best examples is what Bobby was just talking about in terms of the importance of racial equity. You know, just to pick one example, McKinsey did a study recently that Hollywood has missed $10 billion a year in revenue because the industry has been run by white men who have not appreciated the stories of people of color or of women. And they have missed making the films that would have attracted those audiences in huge numbers. When I think about employees and the challenges companies have recruiting employees and the importance of employee engagement and morale, there's no question that companies that have a true commitment to a social purpose, that really embrace shared value, are finding it easier to recruit employees and are finding greater employee engagement. When I think about how companies report their results, more and more companies are using integrated financial reports that are bringing the social and environmental impact together with their financial performance. And they're talking about their social and environmental impact on the quarterly earnings calls to investors, not just to NGOs and not just in press releases. And when you talk about investors, there's been a massive shift too. In the US, 25% of all new money that went into mutual funds last year went into ESG funds. That's $51 billion. And there are now 4 times as many ESG funds as there were a decade ago. So there's a lot to be optimistic about in terms of the change companies are making. And I'll have to say, I've learned a lot over these 10 years as well. I've learned that most companies are operating on business models that were developed decades, in some cases like banking or life insurance, centuries ago. The business models were developed when we didn't know about climate change. We didn't know about social determinants of health. We didn't even know that smoking was bad for you. And yet science and scientific knowledge has advanced. We now know a great deal more about the impact that companies are having on our planet and our people. And so companies face a choice. They need to figure out how to shift their business model to take into account what we know today. And far too many companies are instead choosing to ignore what we know today in the hope that they can keep their existing business model for just a few more quarters to earn those profits without having to make radical changes. I've come to see that there are really 3 types of shared value companies. There are companies that are born with a shared value mission like Tesla. There are companies that are doing good in the world like pharmaceutical companies. But until they become explicitly focused on reaching populations that they're not serving today, rural villages in India, low-income populations in the United States, being sure that they are developing drugs that meet the needs not just of affluent white customers, but of lower income customers and people of color. They can transition to a more shared value business model. And then there are companies where, given what we know today, their basic business model is harmful. And that's certainly fossil fuel companies. That is some of the food and beverage companies that are driving sugary drinks and so on. And those companies need a fundamental transformation if they're going to become shared value companies. And that is very, very hard to do. And frankly, it is not happening nearly fast enough. And so for all that the world has moved toward shared value, has embraced the social purpose of business, it is nowhere near enough. If we look at what is happening at COP26, even as we speak, if we think about all that money going into ESG funds, but we really don't know what ESG funds are or do. ESG measurement itself is so deeply flawed and inconsistent. And I teach a course to MBAs at Harvard Business School on purpose and profit and shared value. But I find that students come into my class still assuming that maximizing shareholder value at all costs is the goal of business, that social initiatives, that the social impact of business is fundamentally about public relations, not about strategy. And I continue to see companies that are merely making remedial changes around the periphery of their operations rather than rethinking their business model in a way to drive competitive advantage through positive social impact. We have a session tomorrow that I hope you will join me for, where Paulina Murphy from the World Benchmarking Alliance will tell us about their detailed and extensive study of 2,000 companies around the world in different industries to track their progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't want to steal Paulina's thunder, but I will tell you the answer is we are nowhere near on track. In industry after industry, 2%, 5%, maybe 10% of the world's leading companies are actually on track to meet their goals. For all that we have made improvements in how we measure the social impact of companies, and there have been wonderful improvements, those measurements are still divorced from the business plans and the profit drivers that the companies are focused on. And because the way we measure social impact is separate from the way that we measure business success and profitability, unfortunately, there are all too many companies out there that have made commitments to sustainable goals and have put forward business plans for growth and profitability, but the two are completely incompatible with each other. And because the measurement systems are not linked, companies can continue to do that. So for all the optimism, I have to say, I am also deeply frustrated and discouraged. We cannot continue for another 10 years on the slow and tentative path toward shared value that the world's leading companies have been on this last decade. Now, I mentioned Tesla's tremendous success earlier, and it's really quite remarkable, not just the success of Tesla, but the impact that Tesla has had on the entire automobile industry. Tesla was started about 18 years ago when the idea of electric cars was just utter nonsense. Today, every major car company in the world has committed to moving to all electric cars over the next 5 to 10 years. So from the start of Tesla 18 years ago to somewhere between 2025 and 2030, a total of about 30 years, we have shifted the global automobile industry to a fundamentally new business model, changing everything about their production and operations in a way that is one important step toward a sustainable planet. 30 years may seem like a long time, but to change an entire global industry, it's actually pretty remarkable. The problem is every industry needs to go through equivalent degree of change. The business models we have operated on will not work for a future planet that is livable, and that is equitable. And unfortunately, I do not see the kind of massive change that Tesla brought about in the automobile industry in any other industry out there today. Companies continue to prize returning profit to shareholders above all other activities. I'm an advisor to some companies, and I have seen public companies that have already the beginnings of solutions to the fundamental environmental and social problems that are at the core of their business, choosing to spend their profits on share buybacks and dividends instead of investing in bringing those solutions rapidly to scale. 91% of company profits today go either to dividends or share buybacks, rather than being invested in innovation, in growth, in employee wages, and in the steps we need to take to create a sustainable world. You know, as I have taught this course on purpose and profit at Harvard Business School, written many cases studying closely the behavior of companies that shift to shared value, I've come to see that embracing shared value is a choice. And frankly, it's a very personal choice. There are many ways to make a living in the world, many ways to be successful. And there's no question, one can make a lot of money doing things that are harmful to stakeholders, that are unfair to customers, that extract labor at non-livable wages from employees, that destroy the planet. But shared value and everything else we've learned over the last decade and more shows us that there are equally good or better ways to make money in ways that reward employees, giving them economic opportunity and sustainable livelihoods, in ways that innovate to solve the immense environmental problems that we are facing as a planet today, in ways that promote racial equity and the advancement of marginalized populations. There is simply no question anymore that we have a choice about how we want to pursue our careers, lead our companies, and provide for ourselves and our families. We can do it in a way that is fundamentally extractive and destructive of the world around us, or we can do it in a way that creates shared value. As I talk with my students, I've come to see that it takes real courage, even today, to commit to a shared value approach in how one goes about one's career. It still is not the norm. But the reward of committing to a shared value approach is a more meaningful and satisfying life. Viktor Frankl is quoted as saying that man's search for meaning is the most powerful motivator in life. I've come to believe that that is true. But we have to find that meaning in our work. And the way to find that meaning in our work is to focus on creating shared value. I always have students who come to me and they say, you know, we're not going to be the CEO when we graduate, even from Harvard Business School, at least not right away. So how do we become shared value advocates in middle management, in other roles within a company? And I've given some advice and suggestions, and to be sure, whatever your job, whatever your role, there are ways to increase the shared value that your company creates. But I've also come to see that it depends fundamentally on the leadership of company CEOs. And that if the CEOs and the boards and the shareholders do not endorse the idea of a positive social purpose at the root of corporate strategy, it doesn't happen. It takes real courage to make it happen. And so I say to my students today, you've got to go work for a company where the CEO gets it. You've got to find a company, whether it is one of these new disruptors that are born with shared value, whether it is an older company that needs to transition to more explicit shared value, or whether it is one of the dinosaurs, like the fossil fuel companies, that need to fundamentally transform. You need to go to a company where the leadership gets it and is sincerely committed to making this change, because otherwise it just won't happen. So I'm asking each of you today, each of you who is out there in Zoom land listening to these remarks, to think about your own company and your own role there. Are you in a place where you can create shared value, where you can be part of this positive move and accelerate it in the way it needs to be accelerated for us to achieve sustainability? Or are you in a company that does not have that commitment? And if you are in a company that does not have that commitment, can you move the company forward fast enough and strongly? And if not, is this the right place for you to be? The time we have left to save our planet, to overcome the deep economic injustices, is very short. Each of us needs to commit to do our part. We need to honestly look at what we are doing every day in our jobs and decide if we are making the progress that needs to be made fast enough, strongly. And if not, we cannot shirk our responsibility. We need to figure out how to make it happen at the company we're at, or perhaps at some other company. I know this is a profound challenge I am putting in front of you, to think about how your career and how your daily effort at your job is accelerating a move toward shared value. But I believe that is the choice each of us faces. And I believe that the Shared Value Initiative has helped many people figure out how to make that move within their companies or between companies. It has been a powerful way for corporate leaders all over the world to learn from each other how to move more aggressively and more rapidly in shared value. And for that, I am very grateful for the efforts of the Shared Value Initiative and our affiliates around the world. But the ultimate answer is up to each of us. How will we shift what we do to bring about the changes that we know need to happen? And how will we make them happen fast enough? That is the message I want to leave you with today. So for all the good news, and there is a great deal of good news about how the world is moving toward shared value, the fact is, without your help, we will not move as rapidly and as strongly as we need to. So thank you for being with us today. Thank you for participating in this conference. We have many wonderful sessions coming up. And thank you for all that you have already done to move toward shared value, and what you will do, I hope, going forward to move us even more rapidly toward that ultimate goal. Thank you for letting me be with you today, and I wish you a good day.
Thank you, Mark, for that review of the first decade of shared value and for the insights and optimism that will help us move shared value into the next decade. We also appreciate how you continue to push our thinking and challenge us to fundamentally rethink our business models and longstanding ways of operating, even our personal choices to achieve the impact we want to see in the world. With those context-setting remarks by Bobby and Mark, let's now move into a focused discussion on today's topic, economic inclusion. As I shared earlier, my team, Talent Rewire, seeks to increase the economic mobility for workers on the front line, particularly women and people of color. We do this through supporting employers, like yourselves, shift HR practices and policies, but maybe more importantly, the underlying power dynamics, relationships, and mental models that exist within each organization. And engaging with companies, both big and small, from a range of industries, we've learned that the work of economic mobility, and by extension, economic inclusion, is, as Mark shared, the work of disruption. It's disrupting HR and talent systems designed for a workforce that no longer exists. It's disrupting educational systems that provide opportunity to some and not all. Disrupting financial systems that preserve wealth within the few rather than the many. And disrupting our own individual beliefs, behaviors, and choices. We've also found that the work of economic inclusion is a work of empathy, of understanding, of being aware of the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another. In the words of Dr. Brené Brown, empathy is feeling with people. And through feeling with people, we're able to build meaningful connections with them to better inform the solutions we design and implement. In an increasingly diverse and polarized world, empathy is not easy, but it's more important than ever. And I would say requires courage. Economic inclusion, therefore, is both head work and heart work. So as we lean into this topic of economic inclusion, I invite you to bring both your heads and your hearts to today's conversation and learning. Now I'd like to introduce our fireside chat, a discussion between Dan Schulman of PayPal and Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation on democratizing access to capital. Dan Schulman is the president and CEO of PayPal, and under his leadership, the company is focused on democratizing and transforming financial services and e-commerce to improve the financial health of billions of people around the world. With extensive experience in payments and mobile technology, Dan is leading PayPal to reimagine how people move and manage money and how merchants and consumers interact and transact. Darren Walker is the president of the Ford Foundation, a $16 billion international social justice philanthropy. Under his leadership, the Ford Foundation became the first nonprofit in U.S. history to issue a $1 billion designated social bond in U.S. capital markets for proceeds to strengthen and stabilize nonprofit organizations in the wake of COVID-19. Due to a scheduling conflict with our event today, Dan and Darren pre-recorded the conversation on October 28th. I hope you enjoy this dialogue on democratizing access to capital.
Hello, my friend Dan Schulman. There is no CEO I'd rather talk to than you about the opportunity for economic inclusion in this country and, of course, the challenges. The challenges are real in a world and a nation where inequality is actually growing. The top 1% own 43% of the world's wealth. We know the history in our country of redlining, of asset stripping, of predatory lending that has worked against the aspirations you and I have of economic inclusion. I'd like you to talk about how you think capitalism needs to be improved, needs to be addressed in a way that generates more economic inclusion, more shared prosperity.
Well, Darren, it's so great to be with you. It's always great to see you. Can't wait to see you in person as well. And you're right, we share a set of common beliefs. And, you know, I've said publicly many times that I think that capitalism needs an upgrade. I'm a fan of capitalism. I don't know a better economic system. But that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be improved. It clearly does. Too many people in our country, around the world, are being left behind. And I think the pandemic only exposed that with more ferocity. And, you know, there's something like 185 million people in the US that are financially stressed. They struggle every single month to make ends meet. And that does not bode well for our democracy. You know, if you think about it, people, you know, need to think about that the system is working for them. If they work hard, they'll get ahead. Their kids will have a better life than they do. And if they feel that isn't happening, they tend to radicalize. They tend to work against the system, both on the left and the right. And that is dangerous, not just for our economy, but for our system of governance. And so I'm a big believer that we need to be more than just shareholder focused as a corporation. We need to think about things from a multi-constituency basis. We don't operate in a bubble as a corporation. We're part of our communities. And so I firmly believe we need to stand up. We need to address the shortcomings of capitalism. And I think we all have a responsibility to go and do that. I mean, I know you think about this all the time, Darren. I'm curious about your thoughts. Like, you know, what do we need to do going forward? How do corporations need to think about this? What's the role of corporate governance? And what's the role of like board diversity and leadership diversity in companies? Like, how important is that as we think about a future that is more equal than the one we've had in the past?
Well, there's no doubt that we won't get to economic inclusion if we don't have an economic system itself that is more inclusive and more diverse. And of course, we have to think about, and that really begins with the manifestation of our economy and American-style capitalism, which is the corporation, whether that is public or private, the enterprise, whether it's public or private, and governance. That governance has been historically pretty narrowly limited to white men and more recently women, but very few people of color. And I think we're not going to get there without diversifying. So we need to look at the board structures. We need to look at the composition of boards. It's good that policy, like the NASDAQ policy, like the policy in the state of California mandating diversity, that is going to actually get us part of the way there. But ultimately, this can't be performative. As you well know, this has to be felt genuinely and authentically by leaders of our enterprises, whether they be public and private or private. And in your case, we have talked about the public, but the privates are also very important. Private equity owns literally thousands of companies that employs millions of people. We don't ever talk about the governance of those entities, but we need to talk about them because they're critical. But we also have to talk about policy. Capitalism does not exist in a vacuum. Capitalism and public policy interact in a democracy. And I'm always challenged by this idea of the tension between capitalism and democracy. Democracy must win. Democracy must win. And if capitalism, as you have talked about so eloquently, undermines democracy, undermines our collective common aspirations, then we are going to be really, as a nation, imperiled. Now, I know when you took over PayPal, one of the things you did was to really look in the mirror as a company and ask yourself about your policies around economic inclusion and the financial health and wellness of your staff, your employees. And you had some really tough conversations with the C-suite, with your board, and you did some pretty radical things that many of your peers were not doing. Talk about that journey.
I love talking to you because I always learn something every time I listen to you, and it kind of refines my my point of view and how I think about things. Look, we had a really fortunate opportunity when we spun off from eBay because we could redefine the company. And the single sentence that inspired me and the rest of the executive team was this one, that it is expensive to be poor. And that could not be more true, unfortunately.
Dan, you just hold on. I just have to hear the CEO of a major Fortune 100 company say, it is expensive to be poor. That is a profound statement.
Yeah, I mean, it drives everything. I mean, it's kind of backwards from what you would think, right? The more affluent to cash a check or pay a bill or send money to somebody they live costs them almost nothing, and they can do it instantaneously. If you're less affluent, if you're outside the system, and I told you already how many people are less affluent, it's the majority of our country. Those same transactions don't cost 2 times more, 3 times more. They can go from 20 bips to 600 bips, 800 bips for the same transaction. And so you have those that are underserved. They spend almost $140 billion a year on unnecessary fees and high interest rates. And my view was that the mission of PayPal had to be to address that imbalance. What frustrated me and excited me about our mission is that I think there is a solution rooted in technology in which we can make those same transactions much more affordable, avoid people standing in line for 30 minutes to do these transactions. I mean, being outside the system and paying your bills and managing and moving your money is practically a part-time job if you're not part of the system. And so I did not want to separate out ESG from the business of the company, like set up, a separate, foundation where we would give some money. By the way, all great things to go do. But that isn't like what makes you socially responsible and progressive as a company. Your products and services themselves need to be focused on your mission. Like just one quick thing, we do working capital to small businesses. 70% of our working capital loans go to the 10% of counties where 10 or more banks have closed branches. Those areas are always where the median income is below the national average. And those are predominantly communities that are underserved, people of color, and they absolutely need working capital because, by the way, when we loan them that working capital, their average sales go up by 21 to 22%. And so versus those in the control group that go up 1 to 2%. And so having your products be a part of your mission, and then later on we'll talk about how values support that mission, is the way that you attract the very best people to your company. And if you attract the very best, the most diverse talent, you pay them well, you respect them, then you're going to do well as a company over the medium to long term. And this is something that, is just part and parcel of the mission of PayPal.
But you're really talking about this idea that every person, but in your case, every consumer has a right to live with dignity.
Yeah.
That the predatory system of finance for low-income Americans strips them of their dignity. I mean, as you say, if you have to stand in line 30 minutes to cash your check, if you have to, in order just to go get week to week, be engaged in this financial services ecosystem that is basically dehumanizing. This is an example. I mean, I can be cynical about technology-based solutions because a lot of your friends out there in Silicon Valley are proselytizing that they've got the solution to everything. But in this case, technology truly is the gap closer. It unlocks the solution to how you actually give the consumer dignity in the financial marketplace.
Yeah. Look, I think foundationally, people need to have financial health. They have to have it. If they don't have financial health, everything builds from there. And so I think this is, as we talked about at the very beginning, this is fundamental to our economy and our democracy. And I think this is just a matter of like people thinking like very short term, or are you thinking more medium and long term? And you know, most companies that aspire to move from good to great have to think about things over the medium to the long term. It's easy to maximize profits next quarter, but that is not our responsibility as a company. It's how do we build an environment and a company that supports that over the medium and long term, that lifts all of us up.
Well, I think you have to really speak truth like this to your fellow CEOs. And we have to talk about the incentives that make it harder for the good CEOs who share your philosophy, but might be in a different industry where they're really focused on what the quarterly earnings report is going to be and what the Wall Street cohort of analysts who cover them are going to say about the short term. And so I think we all are really struggling with this short-termism, and we're seeing the implications of it in our economy. We're seeing how the supply chain does not have redundancy because we didn't invest, because often efficiency, analytics, and those who would criticize companies for being inefficient stopped investing in redundant supports that would make it possible to not have the disruption that we're seeing in some industries today. That is a reality. Now, as we get close to the end here, I want to talk to you about leadership and the particular kind of leadership that you've exerted, that you have during your tenure demonstrated the power of. What's your message to those other leaders who would say, oh, Dan's lucky because he's in fintech and those guys are a different sector than we old legacy CPG companies or something, or he gets to march to a different beat because Dan is special and PayPal is in a class of itself. What's your message to those men and women leaders?
Yeah. Well, I'm a big believer that profit and purpose are not at odds with each other, that they're actually complementary. That the single biggest competitive advantage that a company has is the strength of its employees. Can you attract the very best employees to your company? Do they believe in what you're trying to go do? Do they have a passion around it? Do you treat them with respect? Do you make sure that not just their physical health, but their mental health and their financial health are all taken care of? Because if you can do that, then you create competitive advantage in whatever industry you are. Because there is a war for talent out there. Darren, we all face it. It doesn't matter what industry we're in. And I think that employees want to believe in the mission of a company, and they want to believe that it has a set of values that are not just words on a wall, but that we live up to every single day. And you know, that's not easy for CEOs and leaders. Our jobs are much more difficult than they were when all we had to think about, or all we thought we had to think about, was shareholder primacy. You cannot avoid the cultural wars that go around. You have to have a set of values that informs your actions every day. You know, we withdrew from North Carolina when they passed House Bill 2, which we felt allowed for the discrimination of somebody because of their sexual orientation or sexual identity. We stood up against the immigration bill. You know, we post the death of George Floyd and so many others. We said, you know what? This can't be a moment in time. It has to be a movement over time. We need to be a part of the fight. And that's why we put up $535 million to battle the racial wealth gap that is the same today as it was back in the 1960s. And so I think doing this and standing up and having a mission and a set of values that drive your actions is the right thing for every company to do because it attracts the right employees. They're engaged and energized. And this is the way we lift like companies up, our sectors up, our economy up, and our democracy.
That's right. But, you know, it's interesting. I would also add a dimension, certainly when I think about you, and that's the dimension of moral leadership. Yes, it's a war for talent, and yes, it will inure to the ROI, EPS, no doubt. But we need in this country moral leaders, and I don't mean moralizing, proselytizing leaders. I mean leaders who stand for something and operate from a place of grace and generosity and love. And we don't hear leaders talking about that very much. And I think that's a shame because I think our people, our stakeholders want authentic leaders who genuinely are who they are, vulnerable human beings who are flawed, who are not perfect, but who seek to serve. We don't hear enough about this idea that we are here to serve. I feel every day that I am so fortunate to serve the Ford Foundation and its mission, the grantees and the stakeholders, and the legacy of the Ford Foundation. So I just want to just put a little pin on that. And I want to close, Dan, because I know the work that you have done at PayPal and beyond has really set you apart. And I'd love for you just to, with me, reflect on briefly the journey and the go forward. And I will just say, on the issue of hope, I am hopeful. I believe that hope is the oxygen of our democracy. And there is no doubt that this nation needs hope. And I know that you join me because you too believe in this idea of the American dream. And I'm reminded that we're the only nation that has the word dream attached to it. Mm-hmm. The American dream cannot be lost. Our democracy cannot be lost. And leaders like you, Dan Schulman, give me hope that the future can be bright and that this challenge of economic inclusion is not a mirage, but can be a reality. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Darren. Appreciate it. It's always great to be with you. Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed this terrific dialogue between Darren and Dan, and I appreciate them pulling back the curtain to show what it takes to create disruption. They're powerful examples of the courageous, values-driven leadership required for greater economic inclusion. Now I'd like to introduce a short video featuring Tiku Barnard, the CEO of the Shared Value Africa Initiative, based in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Good morning, afternoon, and good evening from Johannesburg, South Africa. On the Africa continent, The Shared Value Africa initiative officially launched just over 3.5 years ago, and our continent still has a long, long way to go before businesses truly understand that they have a responsibility to embrace and adopt shared value. I personally have often speculated how different COVID would have been if we had more companies practicing shared value, companies that were more agile and innovative and risk-averse, how different the world would have been today. In addition, with COVID, what if we had more women in leadership positions at large institutions? More women leading the pharmaceutical sector, and maybe the IP for COVID would have been shared already. I love my continent with a deep passion, as I believe Africa is where our real global future is being created. However, we are decades away from any real economic inclusion. Just looking at women in Africa from an economic inclusion perspective, women were and are disproportionately affected by COVID. Change is driven by leadership. Leadership that is bold and intentional and driven by a higher purpose that understand the true value of value creation. In Africa, we have a responsibility to service not just the privileged few. We need to find innovative solutions where we can profitably include and serve the sectors of our society that have been excluded for far too long. We, as the Shared Value Africa initiative, believe that creating shared value is all-inclusive and does not exclude any stakeholders, thus ensuring that we leave no one behind, especially our women.
Thank you, Tiki, for your thoughtful perspective on shared value from the African continent and for the work you and your team do every day to advance the practice with companies and entrepreneurs in Africa. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our next fireside chat. This session features Melody Barnes of the University of Virginia, who will be in conversation with Rebecca Marmont of Unilever. Melody Barnes is Executive Director of the University of Virginia's Karsh Institute of Democracy and Co-Director for Policy and Public Affairs for the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia. Melody was Assistant to President Barack Obama and Director of the White House Domestic Policy Council, Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress, and Chief Counsel to the late Senator Edward M. Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Rebecca Marmont is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Unilever. She's responsible for Unilever's sustainability strategy and implementation globally. This includes embedding sustainability across the functions and divisions, as well as heading external engagement, advocacy, and partnerships across Unilever's priority areas on climate and environment, health and well-being, and the social agenda. We'll have an audience Q&A portion for this discussion, so please submit your questions using the Q&A function. Melody, over to you. We're looking forward to your conversation with Rebecca.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. And it's fantastic to be here with all of you, and in particular to be engaged in conversation with Rebecca this morning. And I'm looking forward to all the things that we'll be able to discuss about a really important issue. I think, as we know, across the country and around the world, urgent questions are being asked about the relationship between the private sector and our country's biggest challenges. We also know that as our societies become less inclusive, that these are conversations that are not only taking place at kitchen tables, but they're also rippling across our communities, across the country, and around the globe. That people are deeply concerned as they see this lack of inclusivity having a deep effect on the fabric of our communities, of having a significant impact on the loss of faith in institutions and the ability for our countries to respond to the needs of their populations, and in some cases, even affecting the norms in our countries. The challenge is significant, and the ripple effect is significant and longstanding. So as a result, Rebecca and I want to have a conversation about just that, the relationship between the private sector and one of our biggest challenges, which is economic inclusion. Rebecca, we know that business has historically served as the economic engine for our communities, creating jobs and increasing a standard of living for workers and for their families. But over time, as I mentioned, people have become even more concerned as they see the lack of inclusivity, as they see the shrink or the widening gap between corporations and corporate leaders and the lives that they're able to lead and their ability to provide for their families. In fact, there was a Credit Suisse report that I'm sure many of you have seen that shows that the richest 1% of adults own 43% of the world's wealth. So without economic inclusion, other forms of inclusion are also becoming even more challenging. So Rebecca, I want to start out our conversation today by asking you about what business leaders should be doing. And what do you say to business leaders when they're confronted with these facts and the concern that we're hearing from workers and from others in communities?
Well, thanks very much, Melody, and good morning, good afternoon. I'm in London and it's almost getting dark here. So really thanks so much for inviting me along today. I think that inequality, you're absolutely right, Melody, has got to change. It isn't right. But business can make a big contribution to tackling that inequality through contributing to economic growth, through job creation, the right kind of essential goods and services. Businesses that only exist for the benefit of a tiny minority destroy trust in institutions and in the private sector. And we've seen that so much recently. It's come through in studies like the Edelman Trust Barometer. Trust is at an all-time low of big institutions. And I think that's been further accentuated by this increasing economic divide that we're seeing. It fractures societies. We know that within country, income inequality is worsening for over 2/3 of the world population. And with climate change as well, it's really disproportionately affecting the poorest communities around the world. It's massively holding back economic progress, just at a time when governments all around the globe are trying to get society back on course with the pandemic still raging. So 1 billion adults are still unbanked, of which over half of that is women. And there's limited access to life-changing tech, to services, and all of that is blocking economic growth. And I think when we look back pre-COVID, already we had a fractured society broken up by gender grouping, by age grouping, by race grouping. And unfortunately, in many instances, I think that has been exacerbated by the pandemic as well. We've seen global billionaire wealth increase by $3.9 trillion, whereas global workers' combined earnings fell by $3.7 trillion. And we know that lots and lots of studies from many different countries around the world have shown it's those economically disadvantaged groups that were hardest hit by COVID. I think I got back from the COP taking place in Glasgow here in the UK yesterday. And thankfully, there has been a bit of a shift about just talking about the damaging environmental consequences of climate change, which, as we know, are awful, to actually a greater focus on climate justice. It's smallholder farmers and fishing communities that are being hardest hit by the impacts of climate change, extreme weather, whether it's droughts, flooding. They're impacting the lives of communities around the world that are often the most poorest and marginalised within that country, and forcing them into jobs or areas of agriculture that are linked into things like deforestation because there are no other options. So I think business has a massive, massive job to do. What we've tried to do at Unilever, and I see other companies thankfully now starting to do this, is fully integrate sustainability into our value chain, because as companies, businesses are only going to grow, actually truly grow, if the communities that they're serving are prospering as well. So what we've tried to do is take that process in 4 stages. So we say we need to get our own house in order. We then need to work right the way across our value chain. So for a company like Unilever, that's from the sourcing of our raw materials, our crops and commodities, working with smallholders through the manufacturing process, and then out into the communities that we're serving. And often that's sold through, might be small scale retailers or large retailers, but really thinking about how do we put economic inclusion and sustainability at the heart of all of those different touch points. And I say, lastly, this isn't something that we can do just as Unilever or just as individual businesses. This inequality issue is pervasive, and what we need to do is have the right kind of approach, a bit like a sort of social equivalent for net zero. So there's groups now recently set up like the Business Commission to tackle inequality, where you've brought together lots and lots of different businesses from different sectors to actually look at how do you have a proper business model that understands the importance of the economic imperative and really make sure that communities are consulted in how businesses are growing.
Yeah, Rebecca, that's fantastic. I mean, you've talked about building this lens into the business model. So it isn't something that's marginalized or sitting on the side, but it's part of the air that a business is breathing as it's doing its work. And to that end, I want to do a deeper dive on what you all are doing at Unilever. Unilever is a huge company, and it is an umbrella for a number of iconic brands. I mean, I think you all are probably making money, a lot of money just on me alone on Ben & Jerry. But there's also Vaseline and Lipton iced tea and Dove soap. I mean, brands that are sitting in all of our kitchen cabinets. And in 2021, you announced 8 social commitments that were clustered under 3 different pillars: raising living standards, creating opportunities around inclusivity, and preparing people for the future of work. And I want you to tell us a little bit more about what drove you to developing that strategy and the commitment, and what you learned along the way, and not just the good things, but also what you would do differently if you knew then what you know now.
Yeah, thanks, Melody. So I said just a couple of minutes ago, I think the 3 biggest threats that we're all facing wherever we live in the world are climate change, nature loss, and social inequality. So what we realized at Unilever is that if we want to be a business that can thrive, we need to actually structure the business in a different way to put sustainability at the heart of what we're doing and across our value chain. We believe that actually that's the best way to future-proof our business, to serve the communities that we're serving around the world. And we also firmly believe it drives superior financial performance. It's a different way of doing business that is more equitable for all of those different touch points. And it's really, really important to all of our stakeholders as well. When you look around the world and you see the rise of cultural movements, really, really important cultural movements, the Me Too campaign or Black Lives Matter or Time's Up, people want to see institutions changing the world in a positive way. That we know when we speak to our consumers around the world, over 2/3 of them want to associate with brands or with services that stand up for things that they believe in. And I think that's super, super important. And I think the further that you get down the age groupings as well, we look at the younger generation growing up now, that's not even something that's up for debate. There is zero tolerance around brands that are not pursuing causes and issues that are important to the people that we're serving. And we've also seen this as well changing in the investor community. ESG now is really mainstream, and I'm pleased to see in the context of this conversation, the S, the social part of that, is also gaining increasing prevalence, which is absolutely right. So specifically in terms of the commitment that we made around fairer and more socially inclusive society. So underpinning all of that work is our focus on human rights. So absolutely that's got to be first and foremost. So we set out a whole raft of different actions. We made a commitment to make sure that fair living wage is paid right the way across our value chain by 2030. So we're trying to build a movement towards living wage economies. And that's not just us at Unilever, that's all of our immediate suppliers as well. So as an example, we had a big event back in August, with Partner with Purpose, where we got together our top 450 suppliers. And actually we've already got them now to commit, so 80% of them are also committing to doing that as well. And really starting to see much more galvanised actions through things like UN Global Compact or the Business for Inclusive Growth movement. Here in the UK, where I'm based, is the UK Living Wage Foundation, and it's setting up a global group as well to try and do the same thing. So different companies, different sectors, and bringing in civil society and trade union participation. And another big focus area that you talked about, you mentioned we've got three, so living standards is one. Second big area for us is equity, diversity and inclusion. I'm really looking at how can we challenge social norms and perceptions. So what we need to do again at Unilever, we always take this approach, get our own operations sorted first, so making sure we've eliminated bias, any discrimination in our own practices and policies, and making sure that we're accelerating much better diverse representations right the way across the business, all different levels of leadership. We need to look at our supply chain, that second stage. And we're spending now 2 billion euros a year with what we're calling diverse businesses. So making sure that we're bringing in companies that are controlled by underrepresented groups. And of course that changes depending according to the country that we're operating in. Sometimes it might be LGBTQI+, it might be people with a disability, it could be particular ethnic minorities in a different country. And entrepreneurship is a really important and powerful way to be able to empower those groups and bring them into the procurement roster of a big global company like Unilever. And then I think the third area, really important and probably one of the greatest, I think, responsibilities, but also opportunities that we have is through the power of our brands. And Melody, you talked about some of those brands like Ben & Jerry's and Dove. Around the world, 2.5 billion people are using our products every day. So the way that we choose to advertise and market those products can have either a massively positive or negative, if we got it wrong, impact on stereotypes in society. So really looking at how do we portray the people in our advertising that are talking about the products and services that Unilever have. So we want to make sure that we're increasing representation from diverse groups across all of our marketing. So for example, and taking that through as well to the actual products themselves. So we've just launched a Rexona deodorant specifically designed for people, for example, with disabilities. So really making sure that we're talking about and showing and portraying communities in a more positive way in our advertising, but making sure that's backed up by product innovation as well. And then of course, that's also the right thing to do in terms of growing our business. There's so much talk and so many stats around how tackling inequality is the right thing to do for business. It can really close the living wage gap, generate an additional $4.5 trillion every year. So business should be acting on this more. But I think when you come to challenges, it's daunting that the size of what we just as Unilever have set out to do, it is daunting. The paying living wage aspect is challenging. We're dependent on working across our supply chain. We need to look at different countries with different legislations, making sure that we're working with governments, with trade unions, with the right kind of stakeholders in different countries around the world to move and shift the needle in that way. It's hard work and it takes a lot of time. I think, as I mentioned, being at the COP this week, really as well, looking at those interlinkages between the work that Unilever was doing on our environmental commitments around net zero, around water usage, etc., and the social, and making sure that we put that social justice lens into the work that we're doing on our environmental commitments. So, I mentioned at the beginning, for example, thinking about why are farmers in markets where we're sourcing, for example, cocoa, why might farmers be working in a way that isn't necessarily contributing to regenerative agriculture? It may even in fact be contributing to deforestation. And that's because we need to have the economic and social unlocks in place to allow people to be able to thrive. So really complicated and requires a very joined up approach from business, from civil society and from government, all working together.
Well, Rebecca, you've touched on a number of different challenges that, to use your word, are daunting. And the work that Unilever is doing to try and take steps and also to engage with those in your business chain and other partners. One of the issues that I think it's critical for us to talk about is, in fact, young people, the young people who are coming into the workforce. And I'm curious if you will talk to us a little bit more about how you all are moving forward with your commitment to prepare, I think it's 10 million young people for jobs of the future and making sure that they have those skills. And tell us how you all are going about that and what those skills are, how you are making the changes that you see as a result of the work that you're doing every day and as you're projecting forward.
You know, Melanie, I feel positive and excited actually when we talk about the future and young people. The world and this fourth industrial revolution that we all talk about is just so radically reshaping the world of work. And COVID, as you and I talked about a bit at the beginning, has further disrupted people's jobs and people's livelihoods. And I think we're both, I can tell, joining this call today from working at home, very different kinds of work patterns that I think we're all getting used to, much more flexibility and really trying to integrate people's home and personal commitments into that work-life balance, really, really important. I saw a study the other day from McKinsey saying about a fifth to a quarter of workforces, certainly in advanced economies, could actually work from home 3 to 5 days a week without loss of productivity. So hopefully bringing a bit more balance. And I think particularly with younger people, those traditional employer-employee dynamics aren't fit anymore. People want to do a job that is rewarding personally and professionally, but they also need to be able to ensure that it fits into the personal restraints that they have in their lives, thinking about working mothers, people with responsibilities for looking after others in the home. We need to be able to create much more flexible environments that actually recognise individual circumstances and that they actually value the openness and the adaptability that brings. So when we were looking at how do we structure our own business in response to all of these changes, and also we think about in automation, you think about AI, new skills that people need that we don't necessarily have at the moment across the world in our global workforce. So we set out a commitment to equip, starting with 10 million young people with the skills that they need for jobs by 2030. We know, and I worry about this, younger people I know in my personal life, but we see this across the world. Those economic impacts of COVID are falling really heavily on young people. They may well and almost definitely have had their education disrupted over the past 18 months. Often younger people are working in sectors like retail and hospitality where perhaps there isn't that same job security. They're bearing the brunt of reduced company hiring in many different countries around the world. And there is a lot of unemployment, really high among young people. And then at the same time, we hear back and we read in the papers and we see on the news that businesses and employer groups are saying that many young people are ill-equipped for the world of work today. There is, in many different countries around the world, a real emphasis on academic attainment in our education systems. It's all very much around making the grade. And of course, we don't need to delve into the reasons or the explanations now, but you can see straight away that depending on the education and the opportunity that you might have had, if you've not been able to go and grow up in an environment where perhaps you've got those right academic qualifications, you're already massively unfairly at a disadvantage. And then beyond, even if you have had the fortune and opportunity to get an academic education, actually we hear all the time now from employers that even with the right kind of academic background, it's actually about skills. It's around creativity, it's around collaboration, it's around communication, around critical thinking. So we've got, on the one hand, young people not able to find relevant jobs, and we've then got employers saying they're not finding people with the right kinds of skills. And I think that mismatch of skills and demand and supply is really leading to a massive crisis in youth unemployment. We need to build the right kind of talent pool for our future young people growing up to be our workers of the future in a much more inclusive way. We've seen, I think a study I read the other day in the UK, nearly a third of employers now report having difficulties filling jobs here in the UK, yet at the same time, the youth unemployment rate is increasing. So I think we've got to think much more around access to pool training opportunities, thinking much more around how do we give young people the right kind of practical opportunities to learn new skills. So I think volunteering is really important. I was reading a study in Nigeria the other day that volunteering was hugely important in helping to prepare young adults while they're at school for how to join the labour market even before they finished. A programme that we've been working on in South Africa called Level Up. It's a youth employability programme, really trying to increase the work readiness of young people coming out of school. Things like Frontline Academy, a global platform to develop skills of young people, help them to get jobs, really trying to encourage a much more entrepreneurial approach. So recognizing it's not necessarily, well, it isn't about academic attainment, it's about using your skills, developing your own ideas, encouraging people to be more entrepreneurial. So something that we've also been looking at is how do we take our existing workforce and make sure with all these crazy macroeconomic changes going on and changes in society, talked a bit about technology and AI, that actually we can reskill or upskill all our employees to have the right kind of skill set by 2025. You know, the pandemic has really accelerated automation. And for employees who are working, for example, on some of our machinery, we want to make sure that they're reskilled and they've got the right kind of skills to be able to move into a different sort of job. And then I think going back to the beginning, we were talking about different kinds of employment models now. So we want to provide all our employees with different kinds of flexible employment options. And I think there's a big call to action there. It's the responsibility of all of our businesses, whatever sector we're in, to ensure that our people are future ready. That's our responsibility to make sure that they have the right skills in place for how that they can succeed.
Well, I completely agree with so many of the things that you were saying. One of the things that you said really caught my eye and made me think about some of the work that I've been doing, the critical thinking skills, often skills that people refer to as soft skills, which is a term that I really dislike. They're not soft skills. I think of them as power skills instead. And what we know, and I used to be on the board, and I'm still involved with an organization here in the States called Year Up. And we know from our studies that employers will often hire for technical skills, but they fire for the lack of those power skills. So I think that that's something that's absolutely critical. You know, and I also think about, and in some other work that I've done with the Aspen Institute, I think about some of the young adults that I think you were alluding to, that if they don't have those education credentials or the right education credentials, that they can find themselves in dire circumstances. We often refer to that cohort of young people as opportunity youth. There used to be language around them as being disconnected youth or at-risk youth, which are negative ways of describing them when they see themselves as full of opportunity and interested in opportunity and ways that they can contribute to the workforce and to their communities. And creating those pathways for them, for the 16 to 24-year-olds who may not have completed secondary, may not have a post-secondary credential of any sort, are not connected to the labor force. Creating and building pathways for them, we have seen to be enormously fruitful. And young people who are then able to build on those early credentials to get well-paying jobs, family wage sustaining jobs. And that also not only has an impact on them, but also on the impact that the children that they may be raising, so their families and their communities. So I think that that's something else that's important. And then I think, and we don't often talk about it enough, this idea of preparing young adults, sometimes also older adults, but young adults to be citizens. And I mean that very, very broadly. And by that, I mean with the skills and the tools so that they can actively engage in their communities. And I think be active members of a labor force, but also helping to articulate their desires for their communities and for their countries along the lines of what you have been describing across this conversation.
You know, I think that's such a vital point, Melody. I really do, because all of us, we've all got multiple personalities. There's our jobs, there's what we do at home, there's what we might do in our personal private lives. There might be a sports club that we're a member of, there might be a religious group that we're a member of. And I think you're so right, is joining up those different facets of the different parts of your life and really thinking about how do we all want to live in a more positive way, thinking about those different touch points that all of us, different groups that we're all part of. I think you're so right, but I find it fascinating listening to you actually around this future of work, because I know you've done so much research and work in this area about preparing young people for jobs of the future. And I think there's such a responsibility for us in our generation, but also a massive opportunity to take some of that and really help young people for the jobs of the future.
Absolutely. And I would love to delve deeper into this, and we'll save that for another time. Because I do want to take a question from the audience. And the person has asked, do you think systems change requires a different kind of collaboration? So as we're trying to get to these large scale changes, does it require us to work together in a different way? What do you think?
100%. I think, I alluded to a model we use at Unilever that we affectionately call the onion, because we say it's all about layers. So we say the first part is you get your own house in order. The second is you work on your value chain. The third is you work through the power of your brand. But then the last part is, what can you do in terms of changing the system? And I think when you start to really think about the stakeholders that are within your ecosystem, it's a much more meaningful way to try and tackle a program or a problem. Something we've been doing on the environmental side for a long time, about 10 years or so, was looking at how do we better work with our consumers who are using our home care products and portfolio to help them to reduce their carbon footprint. And we spent so much time talking and listening and trying to understand the barriers and the triggers to get people to live a more reduced carbon life, try and get their own personal carbon footprints down. So if you were talking to people who were using a washing machine in a developed market, we were talking about turning down the temperature, doing a short wash cycle. And then actually, of course, what we realized is, if you work on the systems change instead, and you really lobby for a renewable energy infrastructure, that's a far more effective thing for us to do across the business community, working with governments, working with civil society groups, because you're actually changing the whole energy infrastructure rather than just thinking about the individual and his or her own responsibility. And I think that's exactly the same on tackling some of these social issues. I talked about what we've been trying to do with things like the Living Wage Coalition. If Unilever, which we are doing, is committed to the living wage across our own network by 2030, that's great. But actually, really, if you want to change society, you need everybody to be paying living wage by 2030. So you need governments to actually raise the minimum wage to make sure that you're providing much more equitable opportunities for everybody, not just for the few that happen to be involved with a particular company. And I think when you look at, sometimes it's working pre-competitively on these big issues, other times it's working with governments, it's listening to civil society groups and understanding the context. I think then that's the only way you get to systems change. I think the point as well that I was talking about 10-15 minutes ago around the role of advertising as well, and really looking at not just Unilever in this example, but actually across the board. We set up a group called the Unstereotype Alliance with UN Women that originally focused on how were many different companies around the world portraying gender in their advertising. And again, a shared set of commitments from a whole host of different companies and organisations around changing gender portrayal in advertising. And then now, as we move forward, we're starting to think about other areas too. So, for example, portraying people with disabilities in advertising. But I think if you don't try and work on that systems level change, inevitably it's going to be a lot slower.
Rebecca, I think we just have literally a couple more, well, not even minutes. But one question that popped up that's a reference to a comment you made earlier about flexibility. The person asked, why do you think the pandemic was the way that led us into these conversations about flexibility. Do you think that that's here to stay? Have we really learned the lesson from the pandemic? If you just want to respond very briefly to that before we have to sign off.
I think they always say, necessity is the mother of invention. I think around the world, we had no choice about working from home. All of a sudden, many companies, governments, organizations around the world had to quickly swap to working from home because of the pandemic. And I think that forced us into making changes very quickly and very efficiently. And actually, I view that as something quite positive, because I imagine at Unilever, if we debated working from home, we'd still be talking about it 18 months later, like any other business, because of all the ramifications. And I think when you're forced into having to take action, you see actually the positives that can come. So I hope, we talked about climate change and taking action there, I hope the same thing happens on the social agenda too. Less talking and thinking and debating and more action straight away, because we've seen as a global community that we can do that when we need to. And, and I hope therefore we'll see that coming through on this debate as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you for that. And I know there were some questions about my comments about opportunity, youth, and measurement as these pathways are being built. I would suggest, since we're out of time, the Opportunity Youth Forum website at the Aspen Institute that I'm affiliated with provides some really meaty information about that. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to go longer, but Rebecca, I do want to thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be in conversation with you this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, given where you are. And thank you so much for sharing the work of Unilever. I look forward to
so nice to meet you, Melody. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You as well. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Rebecca and Melody. I appreciate how your conversation really builds on themes we've heard throughout the day, themes of disruption, fundamentally rethinking business versus tinkering around the edges, and ascribing dignity to others. Dan and Darren mentioned earlier that every consumer has a right to live with dignity. And what I'm hearing from you is the right for employees to live with dignity through receiving a living wage, accessing career pathways, being valued for the full range of their skills, having flexibility. So thank you for that. Next, we have another short video, this time from the chair of the Shared Value Initiative India, Amit Kapoor.
It's a pleasure for me to really get connected to you on this platform, wherein we are really trying to celebrate and discuss the idea of shared value at this Global Leadership Summit 2021. What I've seen is that the world has embraced the whole idea of shared value. And how do we really look at this whole aspect in India? If you really look at the Indian context, and if you really talk about the idea of inclusion, and especially economic inclusion, what we have seen is that India has done some tremendous work over the last few years. One of the most prominent things that actually India did was the whole aspect of the JAM Trinity, what you call as the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and Mobile Trinity. Jan Dhan being the access to financial services or opening up of accounts. Aadhaar was the unique identification for over 1 billion Indians. And mobile is about how access to mobile services has actually happened. If you really look at these three aspects, and which was the motto of the government and which was actually taken care of, or which was really given to the country by the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But what we have seen here is that the corporate world has done a tremendous job of really building up the ecosystem around it. When you really talk about Aadhaar, of course, it was actually done by the government, but if you really look at the two aspects of financial inclusion and access to internet, was something tremendous that was done by the new age companies and new age enterprises, especially if you really talk about financial inclusion. How Paytm has actually done something exceptional is a case study to see. When you talk about something like, say, mobile access, what Indian enterprises have done, especially Jio and Airtel, they have been able to take access to over 700 million people at a very cheap price. Today, when we are really talking about the Indian context, we are talking about 1 GB of data at less than something like, say, close to about 1 GB of data every month or every day of a month for 100 rupees, which is about $1.25, which is something very, very exceptional. And these are all shared value constructs that have actually happened, and they have actually taken India by storm. what we are really seeing here is that how corporate world can actually create business models which really talk about financial inclusion or economic development, and which in turn also create social progress. So when we talk about shared value, it's a celebration of how people can actually work together to create a better quality of life or better ease of living for the citizens of the country. Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to get connected.
Thank you, Amit, for that perspective from India and for sharing your valuable insights about the advancement of shared value in India. Now, I have the honor of introducing our final speaker for the day, Franklin Leonard, founder and CEO of The Blacklist. Franklin is a film and television producer, cultural commentator, and entrepreneur. He's the founder and CEO of The Blacklist, the company that celebrates and supports great screenwriting and the writers who do it via film production. More than 400 scripts from the annual Blacklist survey have been produced as feature films, earning 250 Academy Award nominations and 50 wins, including Juno, King's Speech, and Argo. Franklin's here to share his perspective on the cost of anti-Black bias in the film industry. Franklin, to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Kimberly. I'm just going to keep talking and make sure that my audio is good. So if I could get confirmation of that in the chat, that would be ideal. Working from AirPods because there's construction happening next door. But thank you very much for that kind introduction. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Franklin Leonard. I'm reasonably certain that I'm the least well-known person on the agenda today, so a brief introduction probably makes sense. I run a company called The Blacklist. It's a web-based company for screenwriters, television writers, producers, agents, studios, and talent that began as an ongoing but rudimentary data study to find the best screenplays in Hollywood. And notably, for today's purposes, 2 years ago, Harvard Business School found that controlling for all other factors, movies made from scripts identified by that ongoing study make 90% more in revenue than those made from scripts that aren't. The for-profit company that my team has built since builds on that insight and in many ways functions as an industry metal detector in an almost infinite field of haystacks to identify the best writing and best writers in a now global film industry. It is very much a shared value business in its DNA, and if you'd like to learn more, don't hesitate to contact me. But today I'm actually here to talk about other work that I was involved in that incidentally also has to do with systemic failures in value identification, or put another way, with people leaving a whole lot of money on the table as a result of bad corporate decision making. And in order to do that, we need to take it back to June 2nd, 2020. Some of you may recognize that as Blackout Tuesday, a week after Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd, 81 days after Breonna Taylor was shot and killed in her own home by police, and 100 days after George and Travis McMichael shot Ahmaud Arbery while he was out on a run. My social channels, and I'm sure many of yours, were filled with Black Instagram tiles and corporate solidarity statements with Black Lives Matter, asserting that silence is complicity and that we must all do better, and many other such sentiments. And I have to admit, it was a very surreal experience for me personally. Many of those statements came from Hollywood companies, and I found myself unable to ignore the gap between these workshop platitudes that I was seeing on my phone and laptop and the words and actions that I'd experienced daily as a Black man working in the industry for the last 2 decades. 2 weeks later, my former employer, McKinsey & Company, they're getting a lot of mention here today, made a substantial pro bono commitment of global work to advance racial equity and economic empowerment among Black communities. And I remember thinking, well, if you want to study inequity and disempowerment, do I have a story for you? And as a representative of a loose assemblage of Black Hollywood executives called the Blacklight Collective, I reached out and asked them to study the state of Black people in Hollywood. In March of this year, they released that study, and it's titled Black Representation in Film and Television, The Challenges and Impact of Increasing Diversity. Now, this is a rather anodyne title, but to those paying attention, its findings are rather earth-shattering. At its uppermost levels, as Dr. Kramer has already mentioned, Hollywood is run by white men. This is not exactly surprising. But possibly surprising is that the American film industry is the country's least diverse sector. It is less diverse than natural resources, than finance, than medicine, less diverse even than Donald Trump's cabinet was. And probably as a consequence of this, Black talent has been systematically shut out of creator, director, and writer positions. This is all findings of the McKinsey study. Black actors receive fewer chances to succeed at every stage of their career than their white peers, regardless of their results. That Black talent is in aggregate, often last in and first out, already represented. We're most vulnerable to industry market shocks. And there remain massive financial and social barriers to entry, which have outsized effects on members of the Black community. And again, as a consequence, Black content receives smaller budgets, on average between 25 and 40% smaller, less marketing when those films do get made, on average about 5 to 15% less, and distribution in fewer international territories, on average about 30% fewer. In general business terms, the industry underinvests in product development, underinvests in product manufacturing, underinvests in marketing its products, and fails to make many of those products available in markets where demand very much exists. And I have to acknowledge at this point that there's probably an instinct here to think, well, if any business can lay claim to progressive values, specifically on diversity and inclusion, it must be Hollywood. It's the one place where, as they say, the only color that matters is green. And believe me, I've heard that many, many times throughout my career, but that simply isn't the case. What McKinsey finds is that despite that underinvestment, despite that undersupport, despite that underdistribution, Black content actually delivers a 10% better ROI than equivalent white content. And most remarkably, the aggregate cost of the industry's anti-Black bias likely exceeds $10 billion every year. And that's roughly 7% off the industry's $148 billion current annual revenue. And I think it's important that we remember here, this is only anti-Black bias. It says nothing of the financial cost of similar dynamics affecting other historically underrepresented communities of all racial, gender, and disability backgrounds. In short, it's a lot of money. And obviously that's the cost that attracted the most attention in the New York Times and myriad financial and Hollywood industry publications, but there was an underreported conclusion, an underreported cost, not just to the industry, but to everyone. And I'll quote it here. Both on and off screen, Black talent is pigeonholed and funneled to race-related content, which often plays into stereotypes. Now, of course, this isn't exactly news to anyone who has watched a Hollywood movie or television show going back to Hollywood's first ever blockbuster, Birth of a Nation, a lost cause epic that not only solidified in white America's imagination the view of Black men as criminal predators, it also rebirthed the Ku Klux Klan and gifted them the iconography, the burning crosses, the white robes that they deployed in a resurgence that left thousands of Black people hanging from trees throughout the United States. Unless you think that Hollywood couldn't possibly continue to misrepresent Black people as criminal threats more than 100 years later, a 2016 Vox study found that 64% of on-screen gang members were Black, while a Justice Department study concluded 5 years prior found that only 35% of gang members in America were. I imagine that it's not also news to anyone that the stories that we tell each other influence the way in which we see the world, each other, and ourselves, especially when those stories are told in literally every form from 40 feet to 4 inches high and distributed around the world instantaneously. The 17th century Scottish poet Andrew Fletcher famously said, "Let me write the songs of a nation, and who will make its laws." And that idea that the material world lives downstream from culture is one so old that it's often misattributed to Plato. Is it at all surprising then that the casual murders of Black people, both those captured on smartphones and the many more that preceded the smartphone era, are often predicated on the perception of us as violent and criminal threats? Should we be at all shocked at the chillingly broad chorus of Americans chanting "Build the Wall" when half of Latino immigrant characters are shown on television engaged in criminal activity? This despite the fact that countless studies suggest that immigration, and specifically Latinx immigration, coincide with decrease in neighborhood crime rates. We can be genuinely surprised by the ongoing revelations of the Me Too movement in the context of the stories that Hollywood has told about women and male-female relationships, or at the life expectancy of trans Black women when we consider how they've been represented in the stories that we share with each other when their stories have been acknowledged, when those stories have acknowledged their existence at all. And I imagine at this point that I sound like a bit of a bummer, and undeniably that's a lot of bad news about the state of Hollywood, and additionally a reminder about the not so great state of the world, but it also presents an extraordinary opportunity. What the McKinsey study, and many like it, including those from the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative at USC and UCLA's Bunch Center, also show us is that because of the industry's historical and contemporary failures on these fronts, there are myriad paths to do well by doing good. Or put another way, taking a whole lot of money off the table as a result of good corporate decision making. And though Hollywood is certainly a specific industry, something McKinsey highlights particularly in regards to its highly interdependent value chain, entrenched role of agencies and unions, and the contract nature of work, I'm reasonably certain those opportunities exist in other sectors as well, especially when one looks at the inevitably and increasingly interdependent nature of all businesses, the communities in which they exist and the customers they may serve. The path McKinsey has set forward probably won't be unfamiliar to many of you who've thought about these questions in your own work. Setting intersectional diversity targets throughout organizations in the industry, expanding recruiting beyond traditional top-tier universities, refining job criteria to better reflect the potential for success in our organizations, and tying executive compensation to success in all of these realms. And here's the thing. Throughout my 2 decades in the industry and throughout the time of anyone in the industry who's inquired about these things, we've always heard one principal justification for not doing more. It would cost too much and it would earn too little. But what's clear now is that that actually couldn't be further from the truth. And I think we all know it. Like with many issues, when it comes to ongoing failure, time is money, a lot of money and a whole lot more. When it comes to Hollywood specifically, inclusion isn't costly, exclusion is. And that, I think, inevitably begs a few questions. How much longer will corporate boards and shareholders tolerate these suboptimal, frankly, almost laughable financial outcomes that have been sort of driven by an overwhelmingly white male status quo? And maybe more importantly, are the people who brought us to this moment, are many of you who have brought us to this moment, the people best suited to capture all of the value that's available to be had? Because the truth is, it's been there all along. That value is not new. The dirty little secret of the McKinsey study and its origins is that all along, I and the Blacklist Collective, and probably every Black person in Hollywood, was already aware of what they would find. The underinvestment, the undersupport, the money left on the table, the potential solutions. We just knew that our analysis had been ignored for many of the same reasons that the endemic issues existed in the first place. And we hoped that people would listen to McKinsey because they are hardly woke social justice warriors who would directly benefit from stating these conclusions directly. But all of you have people you work with, or who work for you, or who are your customers, who can tell you the same about your companies and your industries. Maybe they went to Harvard Business School, maybe they didn't. Maybe they went to college, maybe they didn't. Maybe they're your greatest critic. Will you seek them out? Will you encourage them to speak the truth as they know it? Will you listen when they do? And maybe most importantly, will you elevate them to positions befitting their true value, positions that suit the value that they can create for you, for your companies, and frankly, for all of us? I, for one, hope you do. I'll be better off for it, and I suspect all of us will be too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franklin, for those powerful and sobering insights about the cost of anti-Black bias, the cost of exclusion. It's a real financial cost, but more importantly, a social and human cost. Thank you also for highlighting the opportunity to shift mindsets and behaviors to create shared value, not just in the film industry, but for all sectors, all of our industries. What a great way to close this session on economic inclusion. I'm coming away with a lot of great learning, and one thing that's particularly resonating with me is something that Darren Walker from Ford Foundation said, that hope is the oxygen of our democracy. We're the only nation that has the word dream attached to it. And it's for that American dream that my parents immigrated to this country from South Korea. I want to thank all of the speakers who contributed to today's event and the first day of this 3-day summit. I also want to thank our sponsors again for making this summit available to the public. Lastly, I want to remind our partners to log into the private session with Mark Kramer and Bobby Silton that will begin shortly. Thank you to our audience for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's session focused on access to health. It promises to be another powerful lineup of speakers, ideas, and commentary. Thank you again for joining us.
if you're going to take over the controls for letting folks in the room.
Yes, I can do that. Hi, everyone.
All right, I'm going to close
Sounds
my
good.
participant box. Hey, Monica.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great. No
All
cats
right,
today,
excellent.
right? You're in the office, so no kitty cats.
Kitty cats today.
So hopefully we'll have I know some folks are transitioning from prior events, so we'll let folks just trickle in before we get started.
Nice to see so many familiar names, even if not everyone's faces are on.
Yes. All right, I'm just going to wait another couple of minutes if you guys can hang in there before we kick off our conversation today. It looks like folks are slowly trickling in, so. All right, well, I'm going to get us started. And first of all, I want to just say hello and welcome to everyone to this Shared Value Initiative partner session. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Bobby Silton, the Managing Director of the Shared Value Initiative. We wanted to create a bit of a private space here in a more interactive space for our partners and sponsors, as well as the members of the Shared Value Global Network. We know it's a bit late for many of our global network partners in Asia and Australia and India, but we have some representation from the Shared Value Africa Initiative. They're holding their summit this week, and so we appreciate you staying late and staying on Zoom for many hours. So thank you for being here. I hope that all of you got to engage in today's 2-hour event focused on economic inclusion. This is the first time we're doing the summit virtually, so we're learning a lot in the process. And we've also gotten issue specific, which we've gotten some good feedback on. Tomorrow's session is on health access, and Wednesday will close with climate action. So if you have any feedback on our summit, please feel free to send it our way. On this private session as well, please feel free to share comments. So now we're going to shift gears to a more intimate discussion. We're featuring Mark Kramer, who, as you all know, is one of the chief architects of creating Shared Value and the co-founder of the Shared Value Initiative. Through his roles at Harvard Business School and as a senior advisor to the Shared Value Initiative, as well as a leading voice in the business and society space, Mark continues to advance the practice of shared value, and we're so honored to have him with us today and to have him answer some of your questions. The way that we're going to do this is I'm going to be in conversation with Mark. I'll add some of my thoughts as just a former shared value practitioner, as well as someone who speaks regularly to social impact leaders around the world. I'm going to have some folks who have volunteered to ask questions from our audience. And once those questions have been asked and answered, if time permits, we'll open it up for some additional questions. And at that point, I'll provide some instructions for all of you. But in the meantime, if those of you who aren't speaking can just stay on mute, it'll make for better listening for all of us. So let's start first with Christina David. And Christina, if your camera's not already on, if you could turn it on and unmute yourself. And if you share your organization and your role in the company and where you're dialing in from before you ask your question, would be great. So Christina, over to you.
Yes, nice to meet all of you. I hope everybody can hear me. Yes. Okay, so my name is Cristina David. I'm based in Italy and I work for 21 Invest. It's a private equity company with a focus on a share value approach, and I'm a director